just with the actors that we have, they're so much fun. They're so engaging. They have a lot of goodwill. And, I wanted it to be like a intense but really fun ride as well. There was this online community, obviously, that this whole movement, this like dissatisfaction with what was happening, this yearning to connect. And it felt like a perfect opportunity to try and bring that to the theater.
This is the Box Office Podcast. I'm Daniel Loria, the editorial director of Box Office Pro, the pulse of theatrical exhibition. And in this week's episode, we've got Dumb Money director Craig Gillespie talking about the latest film coming out from Sony Pictures Entertainment that is out in limited release this Friday. It's going to be expanding through the month of September. This movie is based on real-life events, the GameStop meme stock saga. It's a tongue twister. I'm not going to get too involved in it. But you guys remember, in the pandemic, a couple of retail stocks weren't doing that well. AMC Entertainment was one of them. The other one was a retail store called GameStop. For the video game fans, a group of investors on Reddit decided to put a bunch of money into that stock. And the movie is now coming out on Friday from Sony. I'll be talking to the director in the feature segment of this week's episode. We've got Rebecca Pahle, deputy editor over at Box Office Pro. Rebecca, welcome to the podcast in this weird, slow news week. Not much by the way of news to talk about. We've got coming out next weekend, other than a limited release from Dumb Money, really nothing major on a wide perspective up until the release of Expendables 4 in late September. So in this mid-September frame, we're going to talk about what happened in the prior weekend. The Nun 2 and My Big Fat Greek Wedding 3 both opened 40% below their predecessors. Not great news, but on the plus side...
But at the same time, not awful. Like, it's not...
Yeah, it wasn't an end of the world, gross for either of those films. And I know Nun 2 is doing rather well internationally. Talking about international grossers, we had a surprise entry in the top 5 here domestically. Rebecca, a Hindi language title, Jawan, coming in with one of the biggest movie stars in the world, breaking in the top 5 in North America.
I mean, how much of a surprise is it really that a movie with Shah Rukh Khan is going to make a ton of money? But, it's true that up until this point, Bollywood films hitting big at the box offices has only really been something that's hit the mainstream here in North America within these last few years. Jawan, starring Shah Rukh Khan, who also starred in the Hindi language film Pathan, which earned a lot of money when it came out in North America back in January, February. It actually got 6.1 million over the weekend, putting it in 4th place. Pathan, by comparison, got 6.9 million. So yeah, it's something definitely to keep an eye on as these Hindi language films come out, because there's definitely a market for them. They're fun as hell and they work on the big screen.
And it's, again, we're broken records here on the podcast. We always talk about the importance of having a diverse slate that appeals to different people. Jawan coming in and breaking into the top 5 in a weekend that the top grossing movie was a sequel about a scary nun. That's good. That's important. I didn't watch the Scary Nun movie. I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen either of the Scary Nun universe films, but I am a big horror fan. I know you're a big horror fan as well, Rebecca, and because it is a slow news week, and we're approaching spooky season. When does spooky season start officially?
About spooky season.
Yeah.
I mean, I think spooky season, I don't know. It's like, when does the summer movie season start? We're already seeing Halloween candy in stores. So maybe it's already here. I don't know. It's always spooky season in my heart.
I like the way you think about this. And I agree. It's always spooky season in our hearts. And when we talk about the theatrical experience, we do have to talk about one of the genres that works best being watched in a communal setting, which are horror movies. And it's not a genre for everybody. It's a genre that the people that are really into it are super into it. And a lot of people that aren't into it, you won't be able to talk them into going to see a scary movie. It's always interesting to me to listen to how other people became horror movie nerds, how you got into the horror movie section at the video store, or why you ended up going to go spend your Friday and Saturday nights at the movies being scared out of your mind. So I will open this part of the conversation, Rebecca, by just blatantly and directly asking you, what's your favorite scary movie?
Oh man, I can never answer the what's your favorite, blank genre movie because it just changes every day. But last weekend I did head out to the Alamo Drafthouse location in Brooklyn for Rialto Pictures re-release remaster of The Wicker Man, and that's definitely like a top 5 movie for me, full stop. So I mean, and I think like over half of the people in the audience hadn't seen the film before. In case there's anybody listening who hasn't seen it, I don't want to spoil the ending, but it really worked well on the big screen.
And we're talking about the original UK version of The Wicker Man, not the wonderful bee-oriented re-release starring
Not the one
Nicolas
with
Cage.
bees or Nick Cage kicking ladies in the face. No,
the
OG with Christopher Lee.
So I will say about that movie, the original Wicker Man, it's among my favorite movie-going experiences when it comes to a scary movie. I saw it originally in a prior re-release, I believe at Film Forum here in New York City. First time ever seeing it on the big screen with an audience. Like you, it is one of my favorite movies
because it's
ever.
just there's nothing in it that's overtly scary, but like that nothing's going to be good for this man.
It's folk horror. It's ambient horror where everything around what's happening in the movie just has this sense of foreboding in there rather than going straight into the gore, straight into the violence. I like that atmospheric horror. I mean, that takes me back to my roots of how I got into this genre to begin with. I never really think of myself as a horror movie person, but when I look at some of my favorite movies, they tend to be horror movies, especially when I think about movies that have a social or cultural relevance, something to say. I find the movies that are most effective at having something to say reflective about society tend to be genre movies, tend to be horror movies. At least that message is best conveyed through that genre for me. I have to think back in my own roots as a cinephile. I think my mom got me into this personally. I look back, obviously, in Mexican culture, there's this whole oral tradition around leyendas, we call them, like legends, which is just spooky stories with Mexican ghosts. That's basically what it is. So you have a bunch of like Mexican like ghost stories. It's a very mystical sort of culture, especially for a very Catholic country. There's a lot of ghost and Satan talk in Mexico as a culture. And I think we as a people are very predisposed to that type of horror. And the horror that works best for me has those elements, those mystical elements underneath the surface. Maybe one of the reasons why my favorite horror director isn't a horror director and it's a director that doesn't make horror movies, it's David Lynch. The sense of dread and terror that I think is most effective on the big screen for me comes from David Lynch. And it's not something I would really think put in that genre in the video store section. So in terms of like classic horror movies, like what got me into it is my mom, I think, having this background of Mexican culture, being predisposed and open to this genre, being a really big Hitchcock fan. The two that are all out and out horror movies are The Birds and Psycho. And I remember watching those when I must have been like 12, 13 years old, loving them and asking my mom for more. Like, where can I see more of this? But that was my original entry point to horror. And when it became mine, when it stopped being something that my parents liked and it started being something that I liked, was a seminal movie, I think, in my own life as a cinephile. It was that release of Scream, which completely opened the floodgates to this MTV teen generation horror when I was becoming a teenager myself. And that launched me into the rabbit hole of liking horror movies. Of course, there's other things. I think the Goosebump books, when I was first reading books in English when I was in elementary school, I think that helped. And, TV shows like Are You Afraid of the Dark on Nickelodeon. I spent 1 year living in Battle Creek, Michigan when I was like in 1995. I was like 10 years old. Those things kind of eased me into it. But it was really Scream that launched me into the genre at a time when you start going to sleepovers. And maybe you're not getting into horror movies at the movies, but you are getting into horror movies when you go to your friend's sleepover party and you stay up watching way too many. I would ask you about it. That's my background of how I got into horror movies. How about yourself? What's your like origin story here as a horror nerd?
Really, my cultural reference points are pretty much the same as yours. Watching Psycho on VHS back when I was, I guess, early teen. I'm not really sure of the age there, but 2001. It was one of my first movies that I really fell in love with, and I do consider it a horror movie. At least it scared the crap out of me. And yeah, Are You Afraid of the Dark? R.L. Stine, the Fear Street books. I got in trouble at a friend's sleepover once. I believe it was freshman year of high school, because I had just seen this, I'd seen this movie that I liked. It had just come out on VHS. I was excited to share it with my friends. And my friend's parents were rightfully like, why did you bring the Blair Witch Project to this high school girl freshman sleepover?
Wait,
What
people
the hell?
people stayed up during Blair Witch Project. To be fair, it's mostly like a camcorder looking at like leaves for most of it. Yeah, I think it works, but it works in a theater setting. I remember sneaking into that movie at the UA Regal 12 in the Falls in Miami, but I can't imagine seeing that in a sleepover.
I mean, I didn't, because it was the kibosh got put on it. Though I will say, I mean, even up to this point, I didn't really start getting into horror films as horror films, honestly, until moving up to New York and getting friends who are also into horror movies, who could, you can watch them communally. You can go to rep screenings, which thankfully up here in New York, we have so many of. I go to the cinema to see old rep horror movies, probably more than anything else, because I didn't really feel that joy of it and that affection towards it until it became part of my friendships and part of a communal experience. And I mean, horror and comedy go so well together. A lot of, me, I love bad horror movies. Like, just give me the worst possible direct to VHS trash, and I love it. It didn't really hit on the level that it does now until I started seeing some of these films in the theater. That's why I'm super excited for The Exorcist 50th anniversary release coming out on October 1st, because I've never seen it on the big screen.
And that's interesting you bring that up, because I think my own relationship with horror, just because it comes at an age when I have to sneak in to watch these movies at the cinema, it ends up happening through home video. And it ends up happening either at a sleepover or, honestly, me like sneaking a rental like past my mom and being able to watch it by myself at like 1 a.m. on a Saturday night when everyone's asleep. A lot of the movies that I love in the genre I end up seeing for the first time like that. I remember watching the original Halloween.
Some of those covers are just so iconic.
Yeah, there's no other experience like walking the aisles of a video store and finding a horror movie that you pick on the cover art alone. And that's what I did when I found a copy of John Carpenter's Halloween with the butcher knife and the jack-o'-lantern. And we talk about like seminal horror movies. Of course, Scream was, I think, a cultural phenomenon for people our age.
That was when our family, we wore that VHS out. Scream was just constantly on.
And it's a movie that celebrates horror movies, right? And there's so many references, and it's a whodunit, it's a mystery flick. Of course, I didn't get any of it either. But it sort of opens the door. It ends up being a gateway movie. And the gateway that opened up to me was going into the horror section of my local video store, picking up a copy of John Carpenter's Halloween, and falling in love with a slasher in that regard, in a way that like maybe a lot of the franchises that came after Halloween are franchises that I don't really vibe with. I'm not a Friday the 13th guy. I'm not a Nightmare on Elm Street. I love Dreams and Dream Logic. Nightmare on Elm Street, none of those movies work for me. Yeah. I don't know why.
I'm not a big fan of the slashers in general. I like, give me a good like Rosemary's Baby. I mean, that's the top 5, top 3. I don't even know, but it still works so damned well.
It's incredible. Yeah, those movies are the ones that really, really work for me. And then, like I was saying, in terms of once you get to be a certain age and you start understanding the world around you and contextualizing things in your own lived-in experiences and outside of your lived experiences through the fiction you're engaging with, it was always easier for me to connect horror movies with that. I think even 2 of the 1970s horror movies that I love most to this day, I would still rank as probably the 2 movies that best encapsulate what's happening in the United States right now. I would say that's John Berman's Deliverance and Tobe Hooper's Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Texas Chainsaw, yep. I love it.
I think those 2 movies are near perfect, or as close to perfect as you can have in terms of going out and realizing a vision. And what they say about the United States culturally and socially, it resonated in the 70s. It still resonates today. Conversations about masculinity, about urban versus suburban, about displaced workers, about economies. There are so many great social aspects to both those films that they're still masterpieces if you rewatch them with or without an audience now.
I feel like that. I mean, Rosemary's Baby and Stepford Wives, for me, what they're saying about just, gender relations and how those were, changing at the time. And everyone was trying to wrestle with how to square overarching, big changes with changes in their own lives. I mean, those are still have not aged like a day. I still think they're exactly as relevant as they were before, based on books by the same author. So that makes sense. But yeah, I think we're seeing those movies still come out today. I mean, I feel like Nope is definitely that. Get Out is definitely that. The films of Ari Aster are definitely that. Not that there's anything wrong with just a good old fun horror, explosion fest or gore fest or something like that. I do like that too. But we are still seeing that I think some of the best movies that come out currently are horror films.
And that have like a social edge to them. I think even recently, I think the 2016 election here in the United States was a very divisive election culturally. And some of the movies that came out around that time, I think the best movies that speak to what it was like to live in the United States around that time were horror movies that came out during that era. I think The Witch, definitely one of those movies that I look back on. And I think there's movies like the Ari Aster movies. I think Hereditary is probably the best movie about the Trump era and what that meant socially in the United States for families, that divisiveness around that election, where the scariest place to be in the United States was a dinner table with your relatives in 2016 in many ways. I think Hereditary nails that aspect of it, that generational tension between people, between those social and cultural norms. I love Hereditary for that reason. And of course, Ari Aster, you've got the best breakup movie of all time, Midsommar, coming up after he made Hereditary, also a very recent film in that spate. There's a lot of great titles that I think have given us so much. And these don't necessarily have to be huge blockbuster hits to go out and find an audience theatrically. And I think that's one of the reasons why the genre thrives. Another reason why I think the genre thrives is we're talking about original films, but this is a genre that borrows from itself and remakes itself very often. And I think some of my favorite horror movies are remakes of other horror movies. And I want to go through some of them, but on your end, what's on top?
Oh man, I mean, I had the experience a few years back of Brooklyn Academy of Music, a double feature of the 40s Val Lewton cat people. So obviously black and white, very like he had a shoestring budget and stretched out. You don't really see anything overtly, but it's incredibly scary. And then the Paul Schrader remake immediately after that, which, as you can imagine, given it's Paul Schrader, does not have the subtle approach to human sexuality.
Schrader's not known for subtlety. No. The filmmaker behind American Gigolo.
We're going to add incest. We're going to add nudity. We're going to add just a whole bunch of stuff.
In a way that's, I think, very specific to horror. Horror is very good at finding great remakes of titles. I think on top of my list has to be David Cronenberg's version of The Fly, which I think vastly improves on the original. The Thing, again, going back to Carpenter, these are movies that they see what the tensions were socially and culturally around the 1950s when they're originally released. And these are 1980s remakes that redefine these movies and the way we think about them and modernize them in really interesting ways. Yeah, I think those are two fantastic remakes. Another one that also goes back to the well in the 1980s is Werner Herzog's version of Nosferatu, with Klaus Kinski in the role. I think that's also a film that, imagine that homework assignment. Go back and remake, for a German filmmaker, go back and remake Nosferatu. Let's see how that turns out. And it works out perfectly in a complementary way, right? Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the 1970s remake.
They're both so good.
They're both great. I would probably lean more towards the 70s remake. This is a movie that's been remade like 15 times. That 1970s version with Donald Sutherland. Then there's other ones that have come out more recently. I think I will defend Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead.
That's good. I was just thinking of that one. That is good.
I think it's Zack Snyder's best film, personally. And I would, if you asked...
It was good.
If it wasn't his first, it was early. If you asked me to pick which version to rewatch between Romero's iconic original and Snyder's remake, I think Snyder's remake is a funner movie to rewatch. I'm not going to go into the better conversation, but 9 out of 10 times, I'm going to pick the Dawn remake. I feel...
that's another thing with horror films. They're so rewatchable. Like, I mean, Wicker Man, rewatching it when you know what's going to happen, because you're so keyed up the first time, maybe you're not really paying attention to everything. Like, and that's another reason why, I mean, they tend to remain so prevalent in the cultural consciousness, is like you can rewatch these movies over and over and over and over again in a way that I'm not sure is the same with any other genre, really.
Yeah, not too many. Of course, Wicker Man being an example of one of the remakes that didn't work. There's plenty. I think, Psycho probably being the most famous failed remake assignment when Gus Van Sant went and basically did a shot-for-shot remake in color with Vince Vaughn and Anne Heche. Oof, that wasn't good. But no, sometimes you have these experiments work. I thought, again, very recently, I really liked Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria remake. It's a very different movie than the Giallo original, vastly different film, but I think very interesting. I find more interesting the remake than I do the original.
I could never get into Giallo, honestly. I like it for the titles. I like it for the posters and the style. For me, they're very good looking films, but I could never really, really connect with them. So, horror fan, but not necessarily of every little subgenre.
And the last remake that I think that also really worked into the genre is, I don't know how you feel about this one. The original Let the Right One In, I think, came out at a time when we were both living in New York. I remember watching it on its original release at the IFC Center, and it was a total revelation to me. It was one of those experiences where you come out of a movie feeling you discovered something. And I was extremely apprehensive when there was a US remake with this guy named Matt Reeves.
It was recent. It was recent,
like a
right
year or two after that, right? Yeah, it was Let Me In. And my God, that movie's still good. I even like the remake almost as much as the original. Horror has that ability to do that, like I said, in a way that not too many other genres can count on the remake quality being close, if not better, to the original in all of this.
We've spoken about these before. I mean, was it last year we had not exactly remakes, but additions to the franchise for both Predator and Hellraiser. Predator, by the way, that I think that deserves a spot in my top 5 horror movies. Like, I love the hell out of Predator. It is such a well-paced, tight movie. Like, I love it. But Prey was great too, and you had the idea, just taking the concept, okay, completely different characters. Yeah, it works, and it should have been. If anyone wants to put Prey on the big screen, still today, tomorrow, 10 years from now, I'll see it.
Well, after this, long aside going into why we love the genre so much, going into spooky season, of course, Nun 2 just came out, so there's a loose thematic link in this episode. Let's talk about our favorite movie watching experiences with horror movies, whether that's at home or at the movies. Rebecca, let's start with you. What comes to mind when you think about, wow, I remember exactly where I was when I saw that movie?
Oh man, it's not anywhere near the level of quality that we've been talking about. But honestly, what comes to mind is one of the first movies I went out and saw with the core group of friends I made in New York, 2015's Deathgasm, New Zealand death metal horror that has a long fight scene, people like swatting each other with sex toys. Great movie, fun movie. Like, I don't know, that movie just became like, we still talk about it. So, I mean, that's not Rosemary's Baby, it's not The Exorcist, but Deathgasm is a really fun movie, actually.
Well, if we talk about great experiences, a Deathgasm sounds like a fantastic experience, whether it's at the movies or at home.
Daniel, what would be like your one horror movie that if you could see it on the big screen? Like, what's the bucket list? Like 70 IMAX, whatever the optimal format is for that particular movie, 4DX.
That's a very good question. I have a good answer for this one because this is the best at home watching experience with a horror movie I've ever had. It was, when you're at that age in high school, when it's like one of the last slumber parties, when like it's clearly that like division point where any slumber party you have at this age is just going to be teenagers hooking up the entire time. So you kind of like stop having them officially, but only some people hook up at the slumber parties. That last slumber party, that period in my life, it was me and this girl I had a crush on in Miami. And it was like everybody else was asleep and I knew I could make a move and get into makeout zone. So I decided to put in the most romantic movie I could, my first watching of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre
Oh,
was a
man.
VHS version with a girl I had a crush on in this like sleepover in Miami.
Did
We were
she
the
like
last
it?
people awake. She clearly was waiting for me to make a move. I was like, I'm going to put on a scary movie. This is going to be my play. It was so good. I couldn't stop watching the Texas Chainsaw. She fell asleep. I was riveted. And I don't regret that for a second. I had a great time. To this day, it's probably my favorite experiences watching a movie, that I'm just completely removed from everything around me, from my surroundings. And you're just hooked on what's happening on the screen. The issue with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is that the entire time you're watching it at home, you're wondering what it would be like to see it on a beat up 35 millimeter print on a big screen. The entire time, that's what you're thinking. You, even as like a 15, 16-year-old, as I was at the time, I couldn't stop thinking like, ooh, I bet a print of this would look wonderful. And that tells you something about me.
I have the 4K disc that I won at Bar Trivia, and I can't play it because I don't have a 4K player. But I'm like, Texas Chainsaw needs the grain, it needs the pops. That's I would agree with that one. That would be near the top of my list as well.
And then when I think of movie-going experiences, movies that I actually did get to see the first time with a paying audience at the movies, not a press screening, that doesn't count. I'm not going to put press screenings in there. It does not count. We are limited to the movies that came out during our generation. And like I said, I think I fell in love with this genre as something I wasn't allowed to watch. It felt like a little dangerous. I'm getting away with something. The feeling of seeing something you're not supposed to be seeing, for a cinephile like ourselves, is a central part of why we're attracted to horror movies. That's exactly why we go watch them. So when you become of age to go watch horror movies, that excitement, that never comes back. It never returns. But I did have it for one moment going to see Get Out on opening weekend at the Alamo Drafthouse in Brooklyn. I believe that's where I saw it. I had that feeling of being part of something. And the entire audience is participating and is in the bag for every twist and turn of that movie. It's a special moment that I don't think I'll ever forget. In the same way that anybody that saw The Exorcist during its original theatrical run, whether they liked it or not, they will never forget the cultural experience of seeing it in theaters.
And more recently for me, seeing Skinamarink, it's definitely like a more divisive movie because it doesn't have scares in the traditional way, just mood wise, it's incredibly tense. And everyone in the theater was just like, you could hear a pin drop. You could tell everybody was just kind of like waiting for something to happen. It was a really, like, you could tell some of them didn't like the movie. Maybe a lot of them didn't like the movie, but everybody was into it.
No, I actually didn't get to see Skinamarink. I know it played at the IFC Center for quite a bit. And I love watching movies. It used to be the Waverly Theater. It's a movie theater. That's such an important movie theater for the horror genre. They had, when it was was known as the Waverly, it had that midnight run of Eraserhead. It turned Eraserhead into a cult movie. Turned Night of the Living Dead, the Romero original, into what it is, basically thanks to those midnight screenings back in the early 1970s, late 60s.
Good
yeah,
popcorn.
fantastic place. Yeah, I would say if I were to pick a venue for a horror movie, it would be the IFC Center in New York City. But no, I didn't get to see Skinamarink, and it's one of those things that would I still enjoy it if I watched it at home? I'm not sure. Even though I say that, I've watched most of the horror movies I love at home. I'll give it a shot one of these days when I'm feeding my child at 2 a.m. It's probably the best time to see horror movies now.
I held off on watching Godzilla for the longest time because I was like, no, I'm going to wait for it to be in the cinema. Like, I'm going to experience it for the first time on the big screen. And then I eventually, cracked.
Yeah, you caved.
But
it's hard. And Rebecca and I could go on and on and on talking about horror movies all day, especially on a slow news week here in exhibition. No new wide releases this weekend. Not a huge weekend in the market in the last frame. But we do have a new title coming out to theaters in limited release this Friday. It'll be coming out to theaters and expanding throughout the coming weeks. That is Dumb Money, and we have its director, Craig Gillespie, joining me here in the feature segment of the Box Office Podcast. This interview was recorded before the actors and writers strike. It's important to say that has been affecting our industry. You can find it in our print edition of the magazine that came out last month. And without further ado, here is my conversation with Dumb Money director Craig Gillespie after the break. Well, let me start the conversation, Craig, by just saying in CinemaCon in Las Vegas this April, the big convention with the exhibitors, at the Sony presentation, when Dumb Money came on the screen, I don't think a lot of people knew that the movie was coming. I don't think a lot of people had that on the top of their most excited, most looking forward lists. By the time we left Las Vegas back in April, I think Dumb Money was in the short list of everybody that I spoke with, or most people I spoke with coming out of the show, as one of the titles they couldn't wait to see more of. So that first impression, which is so hard to win over when you're in a room competing with The Rock showing up, with Tom Cruise jumping out of mountains. Listen, your footage was really near the top of the list from the people I spoke with. Great first impression. Were you there in Vegas? Did you hear anything about it?
It was a pretty quick decision. I was like, Sony called the week before and said, "You want to go?" And I was like, "Great." And they said, "Well, we'd show like 3 minutes of footage. What do you want to show?" And I was like, "Let's just show the first 3 minutes of the movie." Because in that first 3 minutes, you meet all the characters, and it sort of just launches you like out of the gate, and just kind of sets like a lot of the tone of the film and the fun of the film. It is definitely aggressive, but I sort of didn't want to shy away from that.
Well, the movie's practically finished, as you mentioned. We're looking forward to a September release. But let's go back to when you first heard about this project. Of course, you first heard about the headlines, this GameStop phenomenon, probably before the Ben Messridge book even came out. Do you recall when you first heard about this phenomenon in the news?
He was 24 at the time. My son was living with us at that point during COVID, and he'd been like following Wall Street bets from very early on. So he was always sort of talking about it and commenting on it, and just the whole culture of it. It's like there's a definite sort of aggressive, un-PC culture to the initial like core group of the Wall Street bets people, and so he was tracking all of that, and then he got involved in investing, and he was on that roller coaster, and he actually ended up doing very well with an option call, like, the day before it skyrocketed, that like worked out great for him. And then, it's like I'd be like doing stuff at working, and he'd come like running in, and it's like Elon Musk just tweeted GameStop, everybody's all nuts. Like, it was blow by blow. And then when it started happening that there was a freeze with Robinhood, again, that commentary like just how like, frustrated and like pissed off and everybody was in the community, and outraged by it. And then the rally that started to happen again. In that very intense period, I mean, he was literally checking his phone every 3 minutes. He'd get up at 3, he'd go to bed at 3 in the morning, get up at 6 in the morning, check what's going on, before markets open. And so I really found that intensity and that emotional roller coaster, I lived through it with him.
Mm-hmm.
I was working on a different film with Rebecca and Lauren, our writers, and that film suddenly collapsed. And the next day, this is I guess 6 months later or 4 months later, the next day they sent over the script, Dumb Money. I loved it. It's like I was projecting a lot of that energy and emotion that I lived through when it was happening with my son. I loved the whole where they'd set it up and weaved between all the characters, and that they really, they had this gray area to it. It's like it really is sort of encouraged everybody's participation in a way, and I think it brings along your own beliefs and perspective. That enables you to sort of choose your path as you watch the film and who you're rooting for. I thought they did a beautiful dance with that, and we just dived right into it.
Yeah, and it was a really quick turnaround. It seems like we all have pandemic brain where it's still like March 2020. That was last week, but it was also last decade. But it feels like everything came together so quickly. Can you tell me about that production cycle, that pre-production cycle? It seems to have been fast-tracked, and you were able to get a great cast to join the project rather quickly.
It was very fast. It's like as with every feature or in the film business, there's a house of cards. So you're thinking it's happening, it's not happening. But we had a very tight window just with my schedule as well. So once I decided that Black Bear came in and set up the financing for us, but it was it was an independent movie, and it was tight. And once I decided let's go for it, with 6 weeks back on this, and within that we were still constantly rewriting. There was a lot of stuff that we were addressing. It's like the whole SEC third act was something to be like worked on during that period. Getting to work, Paul Dano was already attached with me at that starting gate, as with Seth Rogen. We had those two guys, and there was a lot of collaboration with Paul in figuring out the arc of that character and that journey. And so those scenes were constantly being rewritten in the prep. And I just started calling a lot of people that I've crossed paths with, been in contact with, almost made films with, like Pete and I almost made a movie together, and I called him, and Sebastian obviously had a relationship with, and I called him, and Nick Offerman, who I've worked with, I called him. I just started calling everybody that I've, crossed paths with over the years. Anthony Ramos, again, he was attached to a film with me that we were trying to get going. And so amazingly, everybody, was up for the time of it. And what was the most complicated part was, it ranged in time from 3 to 5, except for Paul, it was 8 days. So just figuring out that juggling that schedule, when they had windows, all of that talent, when they could come in, wait, Pete put 2 days and 4 hours.
I can imagine. It's never easy making a film, but under these circumstances, which is something that was in the news last month, to come up with a movie that's going to come in 2 months, it's always stressful, but it's also, I think, a tricky experience for you guys working with your actors to depict people that are actually out there, that are in the news, that you turn on CNBC or Bloomberg, you see their interviews. Could you go into that aspect of making this film? Because having that freedom of it being a fictional story, you can dive right in. But you've done this in the past with Itonia, right?
Exactly. You have to.
Yeah.
Stay very loyal to what the truth is that's out there, and what you can verify. And Rebecca, Angelo, and Lauren Blown were investigative reporters with the Wall Street Journal, and they have a real depth and understanding of that. So as we went through this process, anything that we were writing, everything that we looked at, we had to be able to verify it in either interviews or tweets or posts, so that, it's like we stay very loyal to what was happening, because, we have to from a legal standpoint. So, down to all the verbiage, it's like, as it was said, where, which Sebastian's in the closet, it's like, maybe now's a good time for me to talk to Ken Griffin, like that was a text to be verified,
Yeah.
So,
no, it's always exciting to see these projects come together. In structuring the film, it's also tricky because, as you mentioned, with the third act of the movie, you're dealing with an SEC saga that is going on right now, practically, right? You have to adapt your screenplay and where the characters end up, basically on a day-by-day basis. How did you guys figure that aspect of the film out to not write yourselves into a corner structurally and give that film the option to open up or go in different directions?
Very early on, it's like, and as I started doing the research on Rory Kitty, aka Deep Fucking Value, it's like, he's done a last post. That moment, like when you see the innocence and the enthusiasm and the genuine humanity that he has as he starts out doing these posts, and then when you see his testimony at the SEC, where he's got, he's still doubling down and committed to his position, but he's being very careful about his wordage because there's a lot of scrutiny on him right now. He's become the focal point of this whole movement, and just how measured everything is. It's that is such an interesting journey of that character to get to that point. So very early on, I was I think, his testimony at the SEC should be the end of the film. And then, a couple of months later, he does his final posting, and we still have not heard from him. So it's felt like a very natural place to end the film.
Well, I was going to ask, I haven't seen the film yet, just what we saw at CinemaCon. Were you guys, as you were putting this together, did you try to bring in any elements of the phenomenon outside of GameStop, or how did that come or not come into the production of this film?
The SEC investigation, really, Keith Gill was the only sort of person outside of the corporation that was testifying. It felt like a very natural progression to focus on that story of GameStop, because that was the center focus for that first SEC investigation. So we actually stopped there and let him be the emotional center point to this film.
This very well could have been a limited series in a streaming platform, right? We've seen it with stories like WeWork or the Theranos series. They end up on Hulu, 6 to 8 episodes. Was that a viable avenue? When did you realize that this was a theatrical motion picture as opposed to just a streaming series that you could get a star and go to streaming with?
This was truly an independent film, and obviously that sounds maybe possibly surprising, being that Sony's releasing it. But, we got the financing and shot the movie, and then, you sell the distribution rights, and Sony had been incredibly supportive and came in and bet on it, which was amazing. And that was honestly the hope. It's I love the independent world. I love being able to go out and sell it and betting on ourselves, basically, that we can make a good film and hopefully end up in this place ideally exactly where we hoped we would, which was the partner like Sony who would really can lean in and do a good theatrical release.
So from the start, this was a story that was meant for the big screen, that was meant for the theatrical experience.
Very tricky thing in this climate. It's almost extinct. This size film, trying to find an audience in the theater, but I was cognizant of that in terms of just with the actors that we have, they're so much fun. They're so engaging. They have a lot of goodwill. And, I wanted it to be like a intense but really fun ride as well. There was this online community, obviously, that this whole movement, this dissatisfaction happening, this yearning to connect. And it felt like a perfect opportunity to try and bring that to the theater and make it a community experience again.
As a moviegoer, what can moviegoers that maybe don't know too much about the story, what can they expect in buying a ticket to see Dumb Money when it opens in theaters?
You don't need to know about stocks.
That's a good way of selling it, by the way. That's good.
Yeah, it's this David and Goliath story. It's about the common person feeling marginalized and how they all rallied together and had this moment where they could basically give the middle finger to the big guy.
After spending so much time with this story, with this project, do you think there's an end game? Do you think there was a reform to all of this that went down?
There has not been a reform. It's at this point, maybe this will help keep fanning that. I think that you should have a certain amount of outrage at the end of the film. That was the hope that to feel that there still was things that happened that felt unfair, unjustified, and just that they put it, on people's awareness so that they can, keep being outspoken about it.
And that was Craig Gillespie, director of Dumb Money, coming out in limited release this Friday from Sony Pictures Entertainment. The movie is going to be expanding in the coming weeks throughout the month of September, so don't forget to catch it in theaters. On behalf of myself and my colleague, Rebecca Pahle, thank you for joining us here on the Box Office Podcast. New episodes coming out every Thursday. We're back here next week. But I won't be. I am gone for 3 months. I'll see you guys in 2024. I am out on paternity leave. I'm going to go do the dad thing for a solid 3 months. We'll see how that works out. I'll talk to you guys really at the end of the year. And Rebecca, Pahle, and our colleagues here at Box Office Pro will be tackling the show moving forward. Thank you again for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.